Hello, everyone. My name is Gail Lowe, and I teach at the University of Dundee. And this is Kirsty Gunn. Both of us work on this project together called Imagine Spaces, which is a teaching and educational site, as much as an inquiring site into all sorts of different subjects. But I'll let Kirsty introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kirsty Gunn. I work with Gail on essaying here at the University of Dundee and also through our thinking centre, our nerve centre, Imagine Spaces. And I write novels and I write short stories and I write essays alone and also with Gail. Delighted to be here, Gail.
Okay, this is going to be a kind of free form conversation for maybe about 20 minutes. And we'll just see where it takes us in the spirit of essaying. Okay, the thing I was interested in, because we're also teaching your short story, The Swimming Pool, at first level at the University of Dundee, is that I was quite interested in the short story form. And I wondered if I could press you, because you are a short story writer as well as a novelist, about the differences between the two different forms.
First of all, let me say that as a novelist, I always think of myself as writing short stories. So I've always regarded my novels as being a kind of cluster of short stories. This goes right back to my very first novel that was published called Rain, which I conceived first as a short story, and then another short story that seemed to arrive from that story, and so on, to make up 7 stories that at the time I thought could be actually read in any order. Now that same process goes right through to a more recent novel, The Big Music, which is a very big novel. But nevertheless, I imagined it as a kind of great big sheaf of papers, a whole bunch of separate items that might be in, say, manila envelopes or manila files. So when I was working on that as well, even though the story is much longer and it's much more complicated, involves a greater timeline, and a greater diversity of locations, actually. Nevertheless, I was writing it as though I were writing lots and lots and lots of short stories, which would then be arranged and sorted. Now, the reason I say this, Gail, is because I'm very interested in what happens in that locus, that kind of creative locus. I've just learned the most beautiful word, and I've now forgotten it. For a living zone. I can get it for you, hang on.
Okay.
But in a sense, that's what I think of as a short story. I think of it as this hylosic world. Isn't that great? In which all matter is intrinsically alive. Okay, so the difference between that and a novel, one might imagine, is that a novel, because it's taking place, one's writing of it, is taking place over a much longer period of time, that one's holding that sense of its timeline within one, even as one's working on separate chapters and drafts and so on. And because of that, there's not maybe the same commitment to chapter by chapter that one might have if one is imagining, as I do, the novel to be this cluster of stories. Because by imagining this longer form to be comprised of all of these living species, if you like, within that zone, that ecological space of fiction, we get something that to my mind feels much more alive and exciting, and that seems to be happening there on the page before us, as opposed to falling into that trap that I fear the novel can often fall into, which is becoming no more really than a vehicle for ideas or a vehicle for plot, or ultimately a very fast train that gets you from beginning to the end. Well, the short story, by contrast, invites us to focus on the minute, what I call the present tense of our reading, that we come in to each page of it as though we're attending in the present tense to what's going on there. So those two things, those two approaches seem to me to be very different. And as I say, that's why I write novels as though I'm writing clusters of short stories that all belong together.
Okay, the two questions that I want again to kind of follow up and probe a little bit more in your response. One is in relation to, I suppose, this notion of subordination, or sometimes people use the Greek term, the fancy Greek term, hypotactical, where every little instance is subordinated to kind of wider plan or wider whole, instead of a kind of mosaic or a collage of different fragments, which are much more paratactic because they work in some ways. Not they work associatively, and they might be discrete, but they work associatively. So my question is a short story like poetry?
Well, yes. I mean, I've always been shy of that idea because I've never regarded myself as a poet. And I
Kirsty,
think of poets as being very, very special indeed, good poets. But the approach definitely, yes, is the same, because both the forms are requiring that kind of absolute attention. Both are asking the writer to honor where the idea is going and to follow it imaginatively and intellectually, as opposed to, yes, subordinating that idea to some notion of a plot or something that needs to happen to characters or ideas that are being promulgated or whatever. There's much more of that poetic in the moment attentiveness. But yes, I've always been very shy of describing myself thus. But there's no question that the reason I love short stories so much, and I really, really love them, they were the first and only, you know, when I was starting out as a writer and practicing fiction, I never imagined novels, you know, in the way that so many young writers do. They imagine a novel to be their first kind of work of art. I've always imagined the short story first, and it's something to do with that beautiful containment that one has in a poem, that the short form affords and generously gives us this beautiful sense of everything being delivered in the time of our reading.
Let me maybe again press you a little bit more, because I've just read your Catherine Mansfield birthday lecture, which I really enjoyed, and you used the phrase present tenseness, presentation, I think is the word you used, which actually demands of readers an attentiveness to the making of the story itself as a reading process. So here's a writer writing the story, and here's a writer leaving your room to also in some ways inhabit that particular story.
Yeah.
Is this something that you see to be in some ways slightly different from that kind of world building immersiveness that you get, you know, where it's kind of a wrought article, a finished product, or a finished, what's another word for it? Kind of the well-wrought urn almost, where there's nothing else to give you as a reader, you must just simply take it.
I think that's really beautifully put, Gail, and there is something about the novel. When we talk now about novel, then we should make some definitions, shouldn't we? Because we're talking about the kind of novel that's taught in novel courses. We're talking about the way most reviewers and readers think about fiction. But of course, we know too, there are loads of other kinds of novels. You know, we know there are the novels of Virginia Woolf, for example, that are nothing like those traditional forms. We also know that in Britain, especially, less so in Scotland particularly, but in general in Britain, notions of a novel are quite traditional. They're about stories, they're about characters, they're about things that happen in order to achieve a conclusion. So we should just be clear when we're making the distinctions, that's what we mean. Because yes, as we know, there are other kinds of novels that we find really exciting and return to over and over again that are nothing like those. But yes, in general, there's definitely a feeling that in the short story form, as opposed to those traditional artifacts, we're getting something that feels organic and feels as though it is in relation with the reader, in a way that a poem is, in a way that those other novels aren't, because these novels are created to be pieces of entertainment. They're created to be, as I say, a content delivering machine. They're created to be products, if you like, that traditionally middle class readers with such new time on their hands, leisure that had not been available due to increased automation and industrialization and all these kinds of things, meant that ladies could sit around, and men too, and read novels. And these were a form of what we might think of maybe a series now, a TV series, or they were very social. People could talk about them. Did you see what happened in this section? Did you see, what do you think about this character? Did you like the ending? So everything is being discussed as though, as indeed it is, a kind of commodity, as opposed to this other kind of form that we're interested in, that is tremulous and breathing and volatile, and yes, is as much a product of the reader's engagement and imagination as it is with the writers having created that.
That's really lovely. I like the sense of the quickness and the quiddity of the moment of reading, which comes through words, because words are in some ways unfinished themselves. You have to kind of bring your life to the words as much as the writer brings his or her own kind of interaction and writerly consciousness to the work itself. I'm going to get some of my students to read the Raymond Carver piece on writing, where he says, you know, get in, get out, you know, don't linger, which you've quoted before.
I thought it was Hemingway who says that. I think Hemingway.
Actually, it's Carver.
Is it?
It's actually Raymond Carver. It's from an essay called On Writing, because I tracked it down.
Well, thank you for correcting me, because I've always given that to Hemingway. But yeah, Carver's stuff on short stories is wonderful.
You know, where you don't have backstory, you don't have lots of different characters, you don't have to explain everything, and you don't have to have an orienteering map for all of the worlds that you've built up in that way. But he also quotes kind of V.S. Pritchett. He says the definition of short story is something glimpsed from the corner of the eye in passing, which is such a lovely way to kind of think about, you know, the ways that you can suggest that illuminate without actually kind of delivering the whole thing in its finished kind of artifact.
I think that's really lovely as well. And I've also always described the short stories that I'm trying to make myself as being as though to generate a kind of temperature. So the space of the story, if you like, is a space in which the reader enters and is affected by the temperature of that space. And therefore, when they leave that space, they've been altered by it. And I'm much more interested in that kind of experience than, oh, this is a story about ABC. And in fact, you know what? I have to say to you, if we can ever say this is about this, then perhaps I'm not interested in that kind of short story. Going back to Carver again, I just love the way with none of his stories we can say, this is about this. It's just, no, the story is itself, like a poem again. It can only be experienced by reading it. It can't be like these traditional novels summed up as plot or these ideas or this reflection of this kind of society. Or
does that in some ways reflect your interest in process rather than closure? I mean, in some ways, this whole culture and educational processes are so addicted to closure. You have to know the thing, you have to be expert in it, and you have then got to replicate it or deliver it or your judgment on it.
Absolutely, Gail. That's why you and I are so interested in essaying and this idea of starting up a process of inquiry, of real thought, you know, hard and fast thought. There's nothing about an essay that's a slacker. But nevertheless, yeah, to follow a line and see where it's going to take you and to really press yourself and to press those ideas and not to be so outcome driven. I fear, if I may say, you may want to redact this from the film, but whenever I talk to my daughters or young people, I fear for their wariness about that kind of dangerous thinking. That may take us into dangerous areas wherein one may find oneself cancelled or redacted. Now, you know, to my mind, the thinking is dangerous. You know, thinking makes us do dangerous, dodgy stuff. But that's how we learn about our thinking. And to be constantly shaping our thinking towards an acceptable outcome, or towards a known outcome, or towards an outcome that one deems to be, you know, appropriate, or you know, that is going to be shaped according to dominant cultures. This bothers me. Certainly is an idea that's, you know, very close to my mind when I'm writing a short story. I never ever know where it's going. I never know what's going to happen. And the idea of putting everything in there in order that it may contribute towards its ending, this seems to me to be the most artificial kind of story experience. I love what Frank O'Connor talks about in his collection of essays that were first delivered at Stanford and then collected as a volume. The Lonely Voice, a really good overview of short stories and the development of the form, being a genre that enabled previously unheard voices and lives to be expressed. Carver's a very good example of that, and his work. But he talks about, I think the distinction he makes is a natural or an applied story. And an applied story is one that might have some of your hypertactical features, whereby everything has been really beautifully constructed in order to have this epiphanic moment or satisfying ending or whatever it is, but everything has been constructed very carefully and beautifully to make that happen. As opposed to, he talks about the natural story, which just seems to, of course, write itself, which seems to be more contingent, more random. So one might think of the stories of, say, Woolf and Mansfield and Chekhov. Lawrence at his best. There's a short story by Lawrence called The Blind Man that we used to teach when we taught together in our second year course, that has this, what Frank O'Connor calls this natural quality. But that's sort of quite a nice distinction, because you know, there's no doubt that there are also short story writers who are very very precise in achieving their effects and are no more satisfying for it. You know, think about a writer like Matthew Clam, who wrote a terrific volume of short stories that I used to teach when I first came on the program at Dundee, called Sam the Cat. Gosh, those stories were great, but they were absolutely constructed. You know, they were constructed to punch in the way they did and to have that acidic moment of realization and recognition and so on. They were absolutely applied short stories in Connor's terms. So I'm not saying that one or the other is greater or lesser, but to my mind, that natural short story is the kind of short story I'm engaged with trying to make. And as I say, both short stories, it's the short story form itself that is so damn exciting.
But like the Emperor and the Nightingale, the constructed golden nightingale, which is mechanical, versus the rail nightingale. Well, rail's probably the wrong word, but they're different kinds of things. I mean, one
lovely. Where did that image come from?
Well, you were talking about it, and it just popped into my mind about the difference between organic life and which is
the golden nightingale. Who is that? Your idea? The golden?
No, it's a fairy tale or a little fable about the emperor who wants to capture the nightingale, essentially. And so he constructs, if you like, a mechanical nightingale which delivers everything the rail one does, which is to sing, you know, to sing full of life, etc. But the rail nightingale, I mean, but he misses something else, which is also present in the rail.
Gail, that's amazing. You should write an essay on that.
Okay, now we're coming to essays. The question is, I mean, of course, we have different forms and we always engage in different forms. And so we write poetry, we write novels, we write fiction, non-fiction. What is the difference between, as my students have said to me in some stages for you, between a short story form and the essay? If both actually in some ways might be equally inquiring, both might have spaces which allow readers to think about what is going on in between little sections of it. You know, what is the difference in That's the word I wanted, was interstices, the spaces between words and the spaces between ideas that actually readers might engage with rather than always being told what to think.
Yeah, it's a great question. And for my part, I feel like these two forms are starting to merge more and more. My last novel, Caroline's Bikini, had as its narrator a woman who is asking all the way through the book, is this even a novel? She keeps saying. I think it might be an essay, because she's not sure what to think. She's not sure what to make of the material of her novel. She's given the material for a novel by her best friend, Evan Gordonston, to write a love story, but she doesn't know what to do with the material. So she keeps fiddling with it and asking herself all kinds of questions that are literary and non-literary about it. And yeah, it includes, might this whole thing be an essay? So I am interested in that. And in the short story collection that I'm working on at the moment and working to complete, there's something there that when it was published, the editor referred to it as being either a short story or an essay. And I quite like that. I'd actually written it as an essay, but the fact that it was read as a short story appeals to me. And I've written the title story. I've just recently finished the title story for the collection. And that title story reads as though indeed it were an essay. So it begins with something like the lines, I was having some trouble at home with my writing, so I decided to move out for a while.
All right. I mean, to my mind, I don't write fiction and I can't write fiction. There's something about fiction which I can't get a hold of. But of course I write other things, and I like words and I like sentences, and I kind of pile sentences upon sentences in that way. So I'm still trying to figure out kind of what is it about fiction and what is it about the short story form as well as the novel form that actually makes it quite distinctive as opposed to other kinds of things.
It's because the thing about fiction that is so delicious is that you get to make it all up. And the thing about essaying and nonfiction is that ultimately you are writing within your known world. I mean, you're wanting to take yourself out of that into the what if, the hypothetical, the what now, all of the things that, you and I explored, particularly in that essay that we wrote for Imagine Spaces. But generally, you've got a known palette, if you like. So in that essay, we had the known features of Virginia Woolf reading the Tay Bridge as an organizing metaphor, and so on. Now, with a short story, you just don't know what's going to happen. And the great thing with that story I just told you about, it's okay. So she's having some trouble at home and she's moving out. So where's she moving? What's it like where she moves, and who lives there? And then what's going to happen? You get to do all of that. Yeah. So it's a question of creating imaginative contexts. You get to bring in all kinds of people. You get to make up the whole thing. Is just extraordinarily fictional, and that has its own immense sense of fun and pleasure and danger too, of course.
Okay.
Because you can write about really ugly, scary, horrible things, and find it so difficult to have to, put all that on show too.
Yeah. And because we've got this workshop coming up on water, I'm really interested in water and writing about the water. And there's a little bit in Bernard Cooper's short, well, I don't know how to classify it, because it's neither a short story nor is it an essay of sorts, where he goes into the water and he actually describes what the surreal environment of being underwater and seeing his parents underwater. You've got a little section, which maybe I'd invite you to read from the swimming pool, where you've actually got a little section about the blue space.
Yeah. I will read it.
Yes, could you read it and just let us into your mind what you were thinking when you wrote it?
Yeah. That minute, that tiny second when you hit the water flat on, you lose your breath. All the air flattens out of you like going flat out on concrete. Then the next second, you're sliding and sinking slowly to the bottom of the pool. You touch the bottom. You bounce once there gently like an astronaut, and you feel the bottom of the pool against the soles of your feet, and that's queer, but not queer, because you're the same person, aren't you? Just in another place, that's all. You've still got the same body there. You look around in that blue time, in that deep place. You look around with the same eyes at the milky chlorine blue, and you have so much time there, deep in the water with your same body, but everything's different. Everything's better. I'm never coming up again.
That's so interesting to me because, of course, it starts with first person and then you shift into second person. And what second person allows you, in my mind, it might be quite different from yours, is to blur the distinction of, is to blur the boundaries of the fictional and the direct kind of essayistic quality almost, where you're actually simply talking to a reader outside the text. Mm-hmm. So it might be this woman's actually saying this to someone who hears her, and she's remembering the actual shorts, you know, her diving into the pool and what it looks like in underwater. But there's also a strange moment where I'm thinking, you must be saying that to us.
You know, I talked about that briefly in my Mansfield lecture that you referred to earlier, because it's a technique that Mansfield absolutely hones and has polished in her beautiful expression of what I call present tense reading, you know, and the way that Mansfield's stories return us endlessly to this gorgeous experience of them. You know, they're never an about, they're an is. You are simply part of them. You're there, you're in the center of the stories, participating in them as though in your own life. And that she achieves this in many different ways, but one of them is that use of the second person, because it's a direct way of involving the reader in the experience, and you know, in literal terms, but also has that effect of absolutely. I think Elizabeth Bowen talked about her writing being as transparent as glass, because it was as though there was no writer constructing this experience. It was as though the reader is simply engaged in it. So yeah, I do think that that shift between first person and second person, or third person to second person, is a big part of free and direct narrative. And no doubt I was influenced by Mansfield towards wanting to adopt that kind of approach from an early age.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost, I mean, to me, it's almost like it's of course not a different key signature at all, but there's a kind of strange moment where where it's not really about the story at all somehow.
About experience. It's about experience. You know, here's an opening line from Catherine Mansfield. And after all, the weather was ideal. Now, that's from the story, The Garden Party. And after all, the weather was ideal. I mean, everything about that sentence is just so perfect, because it's absolutely vocable, you might say. I mean, it has all of the sound of spoken speech and the lyricism of a present tense. It also has an implied second person, you know, that we're part of this. You know, we know what it's ideal for. We're about to find out, in actual fact. But the impression that's generated is, oh, you're absolutely in the middle of this, reader. You're part of all of this. You know what's going on here. So all of that is generated so quickly.
Okay, this is me playing devil's advocate a little bit, but it's also a genuine question. How is it different from that kind of immersive world building that you get in some novels? Is it to do with the fragment? It's not extended. It's just an epiphany of sorts at the moment. And I'm just kind of wondering, just feeling my way through the difference here.
I think your answer is in your question, Gail. You know, world building. There's the difference. That we get this very conscientious, often quite heavy-handed, certainly very narratorially driven, you know, that one thing is put down and then another on top of it and another next to it, all in service of creating something that might be like, and after all, the weather is ideal. But it's done in enormous concrete blocks of information, as opposed to this much lighter, impressionistic, musical, and what's the other word I want? Musical and intuitive sense of the glimpse, the idea. It's trusting that your effect is going to be strong enough to bring the reader right inside from the outset, which, going back to your question before, is very much a kind of poetic ideal, isn't it? That the poet spends her life working with words and metaphor and images and ideas and rhythm and sound and all of these things in order to earn the line, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow. Yeah. So yeah, these are the differences. World building is a very different kind of enterprise. Now, the thing is, in a book like Caroline's Bikini or The Big Music or one of my longer novels, you might say that the world being built there is very deliberate. I use endnotes and appendices and so on to provide all of this mapping and detail and all the rest of it. But nevertheless, as I say, the books are always constructed from this idea of a short story. So therefore, certain impressionistic short story-like lines that are used from the outset, I believe, I hope, have those worlds within them. So thus the big music begins, the hills only come back the same, I don't mind. Now within that line, I'm hoping to give you the hills of Sutherland and the hills of Scotland's wild places and the hills of Pibroch and classical traditional Scottish music and history and all of these things. I'm hoping for that. And I'm yearning back and creating this as the book goes on. And yes, as part of that, then we get maps and we get information about where these hills might be and the villages that might be clustered around the base of them and so on. And Caroline's Bikini, a similar thing. All right, I said, I'll try. That's the opening line of Caroline's Bikini. And again, in a stroke, I'm trying to get the intimacy of a relationship, the sense of a dialogue-driven novel, as indeed this will be, a novel that's come out of reportage, of the narration of a discussion, the narration of a story within a story, all of these things. And yes, the world then is, comes in the wake of that. So we get, there are certain parts of West London that people have swimming pools. Crumbs, there's a lot of money sloshing around there. Yeah. And they also, the women who live in these kinds of houses spend all their lives doing nothing, going to the gym and so on. All of these things start to build up. But all of it has come from that first short story writer's impulse to give it all in these moments. More lovely lines from Catherine Mansfield. And in the afternoon, the chairs came.
But then you have, in some ways, Mansfield and you, perhaps you more, are trusting the reader more, rather than insecurity of, I have to just tell it all, I have to show it all, rather than simply suggest it.
Yeah, that's a gorgeous idea. That's a really lovely idea, that the work comes out of a kind of trust. I've just written a sentence down recently on a piece of paper here, and I was going to, when I next saw you, sit down with a cup of tea and jaw away with you about it. Because it was something that came out of my preparing for that lecture on time in Catherine Mansfield. And it's this idea of the reader, the writer, not creating subjects, the short story writer, not creating subjects, but rather the subjects of her stories are for her objects in the way that they are for the reader, so that the reader and writer themselves are the subject of the story. Now, as I say, I need someone super brainy like you, with your beautiful postmodernist, theorized education, to help me nut this one out. But it's something to do with the relationship between altering that subject portal of fiction.
Yeah.
You don't want to use that in the film, but it'd be a fun thing to talk about.
Yeah, there's something that's interesting about that, which I'm trying to puzzle through or describe ways of why free and direct voice is so interesting. And it's about blurring the distinction between inside and outside, which allows you so that you blur the distinction really between objects and subjects and objects in that way.
Okay, we're in the same mindset then. Well, let's think about it, because yeah, I think something of this sort's going on in Moby Dick, even though, he's writing in a very different way.
It's such a collage novel, Moby Dick.
Yeah, but no, I think that there's lots to be pondered here, and I think your word trust is part of it. Comes back to that, because there's an implicit remove from, again, that idea of novel as entertainment, novel as commodity, where a certain contract has to be honored, you might say. What kind of story is that? The reader might call out, if it's not the kind of story the reader wants. Whereas the writer of the poem, the writer of the short story, is thinking perhaps from the beginning, well, because I'm not making that kind of artifact, I have more freedom here to roam. And in the same way, the person who reads my work isn't going to be expecting in that kind of artifact. So they're going to be engaged with me on this process of question and inquiry and risk. Now we come back to the essay again and these similarities between the two forms. I think it's lovely, Gail. Let's think about trust.
But with trust, of course, comes the kind of the more difficult and tricky issue of, do you get it? Do you not get it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know what? There's a beautiful novel by Michael Ondaatje. And by the way, he's someone who works in this way as well. His novels really defy aboutness, even though they've been turned into big Hollywood blockbusters and all the rest of it. And Anil's Ghost, for example, is very political. But nevertheless, he's a poet, and he constructs his novels from poetry and from these beautiful fragments. But at the beginning of his first novel, and I'm just wondering if I have it here, it may be in my office at Dundee. But anyway, it's the little epigraph at the beginning of In the Skin of a Lion. And it's about exactly that. I think even the word trust is used, but the narrator says, listen, I don't know where I'm going with this. It's all happening in a car at night and it's warm outside. And there's a sense of an interlocutor or a passenger next to the narrator. I don't know where I'm going with this, the narrator says, and something like that. Stay with me, stay with me here. We'll get there.
Okay, I'm just wondering whether I have it just to refer to.
We'll go and look up.
Have a quick look. I'll have a quick look.
Yeah. I will too. Hang on. Yeah, I've only got the English version here.
I have got it. In the Skin of a
Yeah,
Lion.
I have the silly old English, well, not silly old, but I've only got the English patient. Have you got it?
Yes,
Brilliant.
I have got it. It's at the start of it. I don't remember the Skin of a Lion so much. It's the epigraph before. This is a story of a young girl.
It's just like a page, isn't it?
Yes, it goes. This is a story of a young girl. This is a story a young girl gathers in a car during the early hours of the morning. She listens and asks questions as the vehicle travels through darkness. Outside, the countryside is unbetrayed. Strange word. That's really interesting. Unbetrayed. But of course it is, because it's dark. Outside, the country is unbetrayed. The man who is driving could say, in that field is a castle, and it would be possible for her to believe him. She listens to the man as he picks up and brings together various corners of the story, attempting to carry it all in his arms. And he is tired, sometimes as elliptical as his concentration on the road, at times overexcited. Do you see? He turns to her in the faint light of the speedometer. Driving the 4 hours to Marmora under 6 stars and a moon, she stays awake to keep him company. That's lovely. I've forgotten about that.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, that's lovely.
Yeah, so that's exactly what you've just been getting at. That beautiful sense of, you know, stay with me here. I'm giving you an indication of what this experience is going to be. And it's a moment of absolute trust. So the reader reads that and enters into this relationship of trust and openness to what's going to unfold.
Is that in some ways not very dangerous, Kirsty? And very kind of anxiety inducing on the part of writers?
Massively. I mean, the whole thing is just, you know, there's nothing easy about it, because this is not like color by numbers. This is not a novel that can be delivered by contract, because, you know, the publishers are expecting a novel a year. This is not a novel that is, to use that wretched concept, part of a series. You know, this is a novel that is forming itself minute by minute, sentence by sentence before your eyes. And yeah, I mean, it causes nothing but tension and anxiety. When I was writing The Big Music, which took 8 years, I was just spending the whole time thinking, the first 3 years, it was like, what is this man doing? You know, he's up on a hill with a newborn baby in his arms. I had no idea. And continued as I was sitting there working away as the years ticked by. What am I doing?
Yeah.
It's kind of like being a mad person.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, how exciting.
Well, it is.
Okay.
That's the thing.
We probably need to wind up, but thank you so much for speaking to us. And it's
Great.
Hopefully this is one of many conversations.
I'd love that. It's been great. As always, I love talking to you.
Now, I don't know, this goes to the ether. I don't know where it comes up, but hopefully it would have recorded.
Okay. And listen, what I might do is, if I get back in any good time, I might give you another call, because